Today, let's build a kneeling chair.
A few months back, I made a desk for my wife, and she hinted at the time that she would also need a chair. Now, fast forward a few months, and she stumbled upon this beautiful design over on the MoMA website.
Originally, I planned to build this chair from laminated sheets of Baltic birch, but with prices skyrocketing right now, I decided to go with 8/4 ash. So once I had all my blanks milled flat and marked out, I headed over to the bandsaw to rough cut the legs. Since these are some really curved sections, I decided it'd be best to leave some 90-degree sections across the joints to give me something to clamp onto. To make sure the joints on the 3 sections meet flush, I use my track saw to cut the jointed sections for the legs. Another option here would be to use a sled over at the table saw, but this was just less setup. From there, I marked out the location for my dominoes. For this build, I'll be using a combination of dominoes and dowels, but you can use whichever you like. So with my dominoes marked out, I plowed the mortises. Just make sure to leave enough space to allow for 2 dominoes in these joints, since they occur in some high stress areas. Using the domino really speeds up these builds, so if you have a chance to try one out in your shop, I would highly recommend it. With the first round of mortises cut, I raised the fence on the domino and cut in the second mortise. One of my 90-degree clamping areas was a little short, but I used some blue tape and CA glue to solve that. I can't tell you how much blue tape I go through in the shop. What consumables you use most in the shop? Let me know in the comments. From there, it was on to the first glue up. I'm using Type-On 2 for this piece since it gives me plenty of setup time and dries a darker color. Oh, and if you want plans for this piece, they're available in the description below.
With the glue dried, I took the legs back over to the bandsaw to cut off the tabs. Now, I gotta say that I love this trick, and I'll definitely be using it more frequently on other projects.
Doing this also allowed me to line up my templates as one whole piece, which is another huge time saver on the project. And as they say, time is precious, so waste it wisely. Since these are some massive chunks of wood with grain running in a few directions, I use a spiral up-down bit from Bits and Bits to cut them out. While this bit can chew through some material, I feel it's important to note that taking off more than an 1/8 inch at a time at this height isn't recommended. Just make sure to cut as close as you can to the line when you're cutting these out at the bandsaw. Then, like the movie Stuck on You, I attach the legs together and routed the other side. Over at the spindle sander, I cleaned up the curved transitions. And since the legs were already stuck together, I decided to go ahead and sand them as one piece to help fix any inconsistencies.
To make the front stretcher, I had to do a little math and draw the piece out in SketchUp. Now, I figured it'd be easier to cut the bevels now than it would be to do so later. I was just careful to save my offcuts.
Then I taped those offcuts back onto the blank to give myself a 90-degree surface to work off of. I couldn't really think of a better way to do this, but if you have an idea, I'd love to hear about how you would do it down in the comments. Using my resaw blade, I cut away the material for the curve. If your bandsaw throat doesn't go this high, you may have to cut this into sections and then glue them back together. Or I suppose you could power carve it. Just be careful not to pinch the blade in the tight inner curve, as I've done that before, and getting it out of the bandsaw can be a pain. Next, I use my random orbit sander to sand to the line, but this is more of an art than a science, so unlock your inner Michelangelo and get to work. Once everything was nice and smooth, I could mark out the placement for the dowels. See, I told you I was using dowels. I made a guide block with my drill press to drill the hole since I needed to make sure that the dowels were 90 degrees to the joint's face. Then I set the depth of the brad point bit with a stop. I used some dowel center markers to help me find the location of the dowels on the leg. This is one of those somewhat tricky sections. I found it easiest to outline the stretcher's joint on the leg and then line it up to make the marks. And hey, if you're enjoying this video, please give it a like. It really helps a ton and I genuinely appreciate the support. From there, I just marked out the line for my dowel block and drove in the holes. One note here, I did use an awl to mark the holes to help line up the brad point bit. Then I could dry fit the stretcher in place, and I was elated to see that all the math and guessing worked out, and I could finally get a good night's sleep.
Next up was the bottom stretcher. I used an offcut from the blanks and resawed it over at the bandsaw to just over 3/4 of an inch. Then I took it to the table saw and put a fresh edge on it.
With my miter gauge set to 85, I cut one end on the board before setting a stop and cutting the other end to its final length. I then clamped the piece at the ends and used a thin strip to mark the curve on both sides of the board. While you could template this piece out, I think just making it one off is faster and works well for this type of piece. At the bandsaw, I cut the curves just outside the line to give me some space to sand back to. Then I sanded the saw marks out of the spindle sander, but you could also do this by hand by wrapping a dowel in some sandpaper. To attach the lower stretcher, I turned back to the domino. Again, you could use dowels here. The domino was just faster for me, and what can I say? I really like using the domino. If you're digging this content and you want to see more, please consider subscribing. Thanks so much for your support.
Next, I made like a $100 crosscut sled. Joking, but because of the whole expensive plywood thing. Since the legs are angled, the top is no longer flat all the way across, so a slight bevel is needed.
Once the miter slot runner was attached and the angle was set, I cut a clean edge onto the sled. If you want to see more about how I make these sleds, check out my modern bar stool build linked in the card above. With the registration blocks attached, I cut the angles. Make sure that you cut the angles to the outside of the leg, or you'll end up compounding the issue with the seat getting way out of square. From there, I sanded everything up to 220 before heading over to the router table to round over the edges. And in case you were curious, I'm using a 1/4 inch roundover bit for all of these pieces. Finally, it was time to glue all 4 pieces together. Now I'm happy to say the glue up went well, which is always a relief when it comes time for assembly. I think we've all had those oh crap moments when gluing, and this one didn't, so that made me really happy. I also saved the beveled offcuts from the center stretcher and used them to form a 90-degree clamping surface for the assembly. To make the seat and leg rests, I'm using some 3/4 inch plywood that I had left over from a previous build. I cut them to their final dimension at the table saw.
So marking the mounting location was a little tricky, but I did get everything figured out with a combination of rules, a compass, and honestly a few prayers.
But in all seriousness, this is one of those moments I had to slow down and double check my measurements. So with everything looking aligned, I drilled the holes for the dowels over at the drill press. I used the block from earlier as a guide, then drilled the holes for the dowels into the tops of the legs. With the pieces fitting like a glove, I used a flush trim saw to cut the dowels down before giving the plywood edges an 1/8 inch round over. Gluing the seats and leg rests were pretty straightforward. However, I did have to use a spring clamp to have enough room for good clamping pressure, so check that your clamps fit before going all in. I branded the seat bottom and then it was time for finish. I applied 3 coats of penetrating oil to finish the chair base, waiting about 12 hours between coats. And if you're looking to purchase any of the items or tools you've seen in this video, I'll have links in the description. Now, full disclosure, I do get a few pennies if you do buy, but I would never recommend anything I don't use myself. And these penetrating oils are great because they're super easy to apply. Just wipe the finish on, wait about 15 minutes and wipe off the excess.
With the finish done, it was time for upholstery. Now this is my first time really upholstering any of my pieces, and I'm no Martha Stewart, but I can get by.
First, I cut the foam to the same dimension as the seat and leg rest ply. Though my foam was a little short, so I used some spray adhesive to stick 2 blocks together. Just do a test beforehand, as some adhesives will eat the foam. With the foam chunks cut, I cut and stapled in some batting before trimming down the fabric. My wife and I picked up this upholstery fabric at a local fabric store, which contrasts nicely with the ash, but obviously you can use whatever heavy-duty fabric you like. Then I busted out the sewing machine and got to work stitching the seams together, which actually went surprisingly easy. A woman at the fabric store was kind enough to recommend a large needle that worked out great. So with everything sewn together, all that was left was to attach the fabric with some staples. My wife and I couldn't be happier with how this one turned out. Subscribe to see more of my projects when they come out, and check out this video next. I'll see you next time.